есть город, который я вижу во сне. О, если бы знали, как дорог у Черного моря открывшийся мне в цветущих акациях город. В цветущих акациях город у Черного моря.
I feel very privileged to speak in this room today, and I just want to give some context of why an Australian male can talk to you about women's equality in Bosnia and Ukraine. A bit of context about my background. I'm currently in my first year doing a PhD looking at the influence of international financial institutions like the IMF and the World Bank and what impact they've had for women's equality, and especially political economic equality in post-conflict countries, and a lot of focus of my research is on Myanmar as well as Bosnia and the Ukraine. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is that research focusing on Bosnia and the Ukraine. And I was originally sparked my interest in this area as I used to do a lot of research in sexual violence against women in Myanmar, the Philippines, and Sri Lanka. And I got interested in this research project as I used to work with refugees in Australia, the ones who are able to get into the country. As you probably all know, we have quite disgusting refugee policies. And I worked with them in medical and legal clinics in my previous background as a medical doctor and a lawyer. So that's where I've come from, and I'm going to only talk for 12 more minutes because I know I'm the last presentation of the day. But to start off with, I'm just going to talk generally about international financial institutions and then go into the case studies of Bosnia and the Ukraine. And just before that, talk very, very briefly about the methodological basis of my study. So firstly, a lot of you probably are aware of the international financial institutions such as the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, USAID, as well as OECD. And so these institutions who either exert economic reform upon countries after conflict or in financial crises, and also donate money with various conditions attached to them. Or sometimes no conditions at all. So a lot of these institutions were formed after World War II, and many were propped up by the United States to, create a global an economic system based on a free market economy. And so as these institutions moved throughout the decades, their roles changed. So for instance, in 1970s, post-colonial Africa, through the economic collapses there, these institutions instigated market reforms. They basically reduced the value of the currencies of a lot of these countries. They opened up markets to international players, reduced labour protection legislation, left a lot of people unemployed, and also raised costs of a lot of bread, maize, very basic staples of living. And then as we got to the 1990s, I'll touch a bit more about what happened in post-communist Eastern Europe. And there's been a lot of criticism basically from these periods about these IFIs, or international financial institutions, that they haven't paid enough attention to the common people or the household in implementing these quite significant economic reforms and really harsh austerity policies. So just to touch very brief, that's the background of my study. And so given the scale of women's exclusion in post-communist society, the influence of international financial institution-led economic restructuring on women's political and economic participation was obviously of a big focus for my research. And we used a methodological statistical analysis, which I'm not going to bore you with because I know it's very late in the day and there's a whole night of socializing to go. But basically it's very different to something like regressional analysis and so forth. And basically the results of that, and I'll talk to you more about this later if you want to talk later tonight about this, is that post-communist countries with high education, low infant mortality, high amounts of aid, low amounts of loans, were more likely to have greater political economic participation. And so we looked at Bosnia and the Ukraine because they were quite interesting countries, and they've both had quite a very high amount of involvement from international financial institutions and high amounts of loans as well as aids, but have still had relatively low political economic participation in women in the post-communist era. So starting looking at Bosnia, Bosnia as a country following the collapse of communism has immediately been defined by the Bosnian War, where women were, I guess, seen in this hyper ethno-nationalistic environment as bodies that, I guess, like conceptualized the enemy's territory, as well as, the cultural and religio-ethno identity of that particular cultural group, and so we're the target of rife sexual violence and war crimes. And so following the Dayton peace processes, there's still a high amount of women who are refugees in the country as well as outside of Bosnia, and still a huge amount of sexual violence against these women that haven't been adequately addressed, and also a lot of widows as well. As most of you may have known, the European High Representative has basically taken over a lot of the political control of Bosnia, and through that control have started to implement vast economic reforms along with US aid, International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. And so a lot of this was directed at deconstructing the centralized Yugoslavia society and the Bosnian society as well, and so has basically resulted in lots of closures of state-run institutions, causing a lot of unemployment. Has also reduced the value of the currency, and reduce social services, cut down education, cut down schools, hospitals, and so forth. And a lot of the analyses from the international finance institutions haven't really taken into adequate account of exactly what this has meant for women. They have kind of slowly started to acknowledge that there is, this hasn't been great for the general population, but it has often been women who have borne the brunt of this restructuring when they've had to take over the roles and the services that the state used to. So they've kind of entrenched themselves in what, and I heard the term before in this conference, have been entrenched in the reproductive economy. And so they've found it very difficult to engage in this new hyper-capitalistic, hyper-masculine environment of competition, free market and so forth, while they've been confined to the home. And just a brief word on Bosnia and the international financial institutions before I finish up. You can see how these institutions have really exerted a huge amount of political influence on the Bosnian entities, so the Republic Srpska as well as the Federation. So the Republic Srpska has often been seen as, and I'm sorry if I'm not pronouncing that correctly, it's my Australian accent, have often been seen as kind of dragging their leg on instituting a lot of these post-Dayton economic reforms. And so only a fraction of loans and aids have actually gone to that republic, and the World Bank and the IMF have been crucial in basically forcing their president to go along to certain post-Dayton commemorations and so forth. And Bosnia now have a huge amount of conditions attached to the loans and the aids that have been given over the years. I think there's about 92 conditions by 2014. So they've got a really distraught economy, and the households there, from what the UNDP have described in 2014, having a lot of difficulty making ends meet and having a lot of dispensable income after just the basics of everyday life. So the 5 minutes remaining, I'm just going to go into the Ukraine now and discuss generally about the post-communist reforms, which I guess started firstly in Central Europe before migrating to the Ukraine and Russia. And I think Patricia might have been starting to discuss that what was happening in Poland and the other Central European economies, where US aid, especially after the fall of communism, it was seen as like a great hope of I guess Western liberalism culture to come in and save the people from communism and establish a hard free market economy with neoliberal policies and practices. And so what a lot of this, it seems from my research, from what I've read, is that a lot of the US aid, the millions upon millions of dollars that have gone into these post-communist countries, firstly in Central, moving over to more Eastern Europe, is that millions of dollars went to American firms as well as other Western firms to basically investigate privatization, leading economic reforms, and the effect of these have been basically to enrich these firms and other Western corporation companies. And sorry, my English isn't very good either. These companies and also to basically enrich the political elite. So the political elite who are in the communist era were very able to work with communist dialogue and so forth to get to certain political positions, and then found an opportunity to switch that dialogue to that of reformers and so forth to basically get themselves in the limelight of this huge amount of money coming in from the West. And so, again, similar to Bosnia, as I described post-Dayton, the state companies were destroyed and like sold off to private institutions and privatized, and a lot of the Western firms sold them basically at fire sale prices, which allowed either Western companies or the elites in these now post-communist countries to grab huge shares and wealth in this new capitalistic environment. And so what this has meant for women has, again, similar to what we've seen in Bosnia. There's been huge amounts of schools cut. Health has also decreased as well. Daycare and so forth has been stripped from the economy, and other things like subsidies, protection for women workers and so forth have been basically taken away from these post-communist countries. And so women have had a difficult time competing in like this hyper-masculine competitive environment when they've been confined to their reproductive role in the post-communist economies of the Ukraine. And just because of time there, I'm just going to leave it there, and I'll thank you once again for listening to me at the end of the day. It's been a big, wonderful day, and if you have any questions or want to discuss, I'm very happy to talk more in the evening. So thank you very much.